In the spring of 2009, a regional agronomist named Dale Hutchins stood in the gravel lot of the Brunner County Co-op and told a 41-year-old woman that her bees were a liability she could not afford. He was not unkind about it. He had a clipboard, a clean white pickup with the Extension Service decal on the door, and a yield map he had printed that morning, and he believed every number on it. The morning was cold for April, and the lot was busy with men loading seed and standing in clusters by their tailgates, and Hutchins had picked his moment in front of them, not out of cruelty, but out of habit, because a teaching man teaches where there is an audience. He held the map up so she could see it, his finger tracing the bright blocks of color that meant high yield. He told her the future belonged to managed acres and predictable inputs, that 30 hives of unsprayed bees on 40 acres of mixed pasture was a hobby dressed up as a farm, and that the smart money was already moving the other way. He said it kindly. He said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis he is sure of. The men by the tailgates were not unkind either, but a few of them looked over, and one of them smiled into his coffee, and that smile was the part Marion remembered for years afterward. She listened. She folded her hands inside the cuffs of her grandfather's old canvas coat and let him finish, and when he was done, she said only that her bees had wintered fine, and she got into her truck and drove home. She did not argue. Arguing was not a thing she did with men holding maps. 12 years later, in the fall of 2021, a buyer from a specialty grocery cooperative in Chicago signed a standing order for her honey at 3 times the price the regional packers had ever paid her, and the same agronomist was standing in her kitchen asking, quietly, if she would be willing to teach a workshop. The map was gone. The certainty was gone. What was left was an older man with his hat in his hands in the kitchen of a woman he had called a hobbyist, and the honesty, at least, to know why he had come. This is the story of the years between those 2 days, and of what a woman named Marion Voss knew about a single piece of ground that the people with the printed maps did not. Let me tell you about Marion first, because the whole thing rests on her, and on the kind of attention she paid that does not show up on any map. She was known in Brunner County for 2 things. The first was that she rarely spoke at the co-op meetings, sitting in the back row in her grandfather's old canvas coat, with her hands folded, listening longer than anyone thought necessary. The second was that her bees did not die. In years when other keepers in the county opened their boxes in March to find clusters gone cold and frames slick with the smell of collapse, Marion lifted her lids and found her colonies alive, lean, and working. People noticed. They did not always know what to make of it. The 40 acres had come down to her from her grandfather, Walter Voss, who had bought the ground in 1951 and kept bees on it until the week he died. He had been a quiet man, too, by every account, a man who had come back from the war and wanted nothing more than a piece of land that would leave him alone, and he had found it in this unfashionable corner of the county, low ground that flooded in the wet years and grew up thick in clover and wild bloom in the dry ones. The neighbors had thought him odd for not draining it and planting it like everyone else. He let it be what it was. He left her more than the land. In the cellar under the farmhouse, on a shelf above the canning jars, sat a leather-bound book the size of a hymnal, its pages soft as cloth from handling, filled front to back with his small, upright handwriting. He had called it the Bee Book. It was not a diary, it was a record. Every page was a season, and every season was a list of what bloomed and when, what the weather did, which hives went into winter heavy and which went in light, what the honey tasted of in July versus September, and where exactly on the 40 acres each colony foraged best. He noted the first dandelion every spring and the last goldenrod every fall. He wrote down the years the basswood failed and the years it carried the whole apiary through August. Walter had started keeping it in 1953, and he had not missed a year by the time. It came to Marion, the book held more than 5 decades of one piece of ground watching itself. She had read it the way other people read Scripture. Not for the answers, but for the way of seeing. And the way of seeing was this. Her grandfather had never treated his bees as livestock to be fed and dosed and pushed. He had treated them as a gauge. The bees told him the truth about the land, and his job was to keep the land worth telling the truth about, which meant he never sprayed. Not the pasture, not the fence rows, not the old orchard at the north end where 6 gnarled apple trees still bloomed every May from a planting older than he was. He let the dandelions come in April because the bees needed them before anything else flowered, and he had written in the book that a man who mows his dandelions in April has decided his lawn matters more than his hives. He left the clover thick and the goldenrod standing into October. He planted nothing he could not let bloom. To the county that grew up around him, this looked like neglect. To Walter, and then to Marion, it was the most deliberate thing on the farm. Every choice not to spray was a choice made on purpose, year after year, for a reason most of his neighbors never bothered to ask him about. Which brings us to the years when everything around her changed at once. The middle of the first decade of this century was when the chemistry arrived in force in Brenner County. The seed came, treated now, coated before it ever reached the ground, and the spray programs grew longer and more confident every season. A man could buy certainty in a jug, and most of them did, because the agronomists were not lying. The treated seed did protect the young plants. The spray programs did raise the yields. For a stretch of years, the numbers were real and the numbers were good, and the farmer who hesitated looked like a man leaving money in the field. Dale Hutchins was the voice of those numbers in the county, and he was good at his job. He had a master's degree in agronomy from the state university. He had run the trial plots himself, and he had watched his recommendations turn into bushels for a decade. He was not a bad man. He simply believed that the land was a system you could fully describe, and that anything you could not measure on his maps was either sentiment or waste. Marion's neighbor to the south was a man named Cliff Tanner, and I want you to hold on to Cliff because his story runs alongside Marion's the whole way, and it does not run where you would want it to. Cliff farmed 400 acres to Marion's 40, and he farmed them well by every standard the co-op recognized. He was a big, easy man in his early 50s, the kind who waved at every truck on the road, whether he knew it or not, and he had inherited his ground the same way Marion had inherited hers, from a father who had farmed it before him. The difference was that Cliff's father had told him to keep up with the times, and Marion's grandfather had told her to keep faith with the ground, and those 2 pieces of advice pointed in opposite directions right at the moment the chemistry arrived. In 2008, Cliff financed a new self-propelled sprayer, a tall yellow machine with a 60-foot boom and a cab quieter than his living room. And he was proud of it the way a man is proud of a thing that finally lets him keep up. The note on it ran 8 years. He did not blink at that because every projection he had been shown said the machine would more than pay for itself, and for a while it did. He followed the program. He bought the treated seed, he ran the passes on schedule, and his corn came up in rows so clean and even, they looked drawn with a ruler. When he leaned on the fence between his ground and Marion's, and looked at her tangle of clover and unmown fence row, and the gray boxes of her hives sitting crooked in the grass, he did not sneer. He worried for her. He told her once on a still evening with the sprayer cooling in his yard behind him that she was farming like it was still her grandfather's time, and that the world had moved on, and he said it, the way you say a hard thing to someone you like. He told her he could put her 40 into a corn bean rotation in a single season and have it paying like real ground inside 2 years, and that he would help her do it. And he meant the offer kindly and completely. She told him the bees would let her know when the world had moved too far. He laughed, not meanly, and looked out across his own clean rows, turning gold in the low light, and said he hoped the bees were paying attention, because the bank sure was. Then he went home to his quiet cab and his 8-year note, and Marion stood at the fence a while longer, watching her hives settle for the night. If you have ever watched a confident person be gentle with someone they have quietly ridden off, you know exactly the weather of that fence line, stay with me, because the gentleness is the part that turns. Now let me tell you what was actually happening in those gray boxes, because the mechanism matters, and without it, the ending is just luck. A honeybee colony is not really a collection of insects. It is closer to a single animal made of 40,000 bodies, and, like any animal, it can be poisoned slowly in ways that do not kill it outright. The treated seed that was spreading across Brunner County carried a class of insecticide that coats the seed and then travels up into every part of the growing plant, into the leaves, the stem, and, most of all, the pollen and the nectar. The plant becomes the dose. A bee foraging a field of treated corn or treated canola does not fall dead in the furrow. She carries a little of the chemical home in the pollen on her legs, and she does it again the next day, and the colony stores it in the comb and feeds it to the young. It does not announce itself. It shows up as a hive that cannot hold its numbers through winter, a queen that fails early, foragers that fly out in the morning and never find their way back. The county was full of keepers who could not understand why their bees kept thinning, because the cause was invisible and it was everywhere, and it was sold to them with a guarantee. Marion's bees foraged 40 acres that had not been sprayed in 50 years, ringed by Walter's old hedgerows of basswood and wild plum that broke the drift from the fields beyond. Her colonies were not stronger because she was lucky. They were stronger because they were eating clean food in a poisoned county, and her grandfather had spent his life building the one clean table for them to eat at. The bee book had a sentence in it, written in 1971, that Marion had underlined herself years later. A hive is only ever as honest as the half-mile around it. That half-mile was the whole inheritance. The deed was just the paper that let her defend it. For a long stretch, defending it cost her. That is the part the vindication stories usually skip, and I will not skip it because Marion paid in real money and real years before any of this turned. Through 2010 and 2011, her honey went to the same regional packer everyone used, a buyer who graded by color and moisture, and paid one flat price by the drum, and that price did not care in the slightest that her honey came from clean ground. 2. The packer, honey, was honey. He paid her the same $something a pound he paid the keeper running sugar-fed bees next to a sprayed field, and some years, because her clean colonies were lean and she refused to push them, she had less of it to sell than he did. Cliff's 400 acres were throwing off more cash in a bad year than Marion's whole operation cleared in a good one. The numbers, the only numbers anyone was keeping, said Dale Hutchins had been right in that gravel lot. Then her granddaughter came home, and the argument Marion had been having with the whole county finally moved indoors. Her name was Bree. She was 23, and she had just finished a degree in agricultural business at the State University, the same university that had granted Dale Hutchins his master's. She came back to Bruner County in the summer of 2014 with a head full of spreadsheets and a real sincere worry about her grandmother. Bree loved Marion. She had spent every childhood summer on the 40 acres, had learned to pull frames without gloves before she learned to drive, and she had gone off to school in part to come back and save the place from what she was sure was its slow decline. She also thought Marion was slowly going broke out of stubbornness, and she had the coursework to prove it. She sat at the kitchen table that first week with a notebook and a laptop, and walked Marion through it line by line under the single hanging bulb that had lit that table since before Bree was born. The cost per hive, the labor hours, which Marion had never once counted, the price per pound, the opportunity cost of 40 acres held out of row crops while the neighbors planted. Fence to fence, she had built a model, she said, and the model was not unkind. It was just honest, and the honest model said the bees lost money every year they were not replaced with something the market actually paid for. By Bree's math, the honest conventional math she had paid 4 years to learn, the bees were a sentiment the farm could not keep affording. I told you, Marion said, that the bees would tell us when the world had moved too far. Bree closed the laptop a little harder than she meant to. That is not a business plan, Grandma, she said. That is a saying. And she was not wrong to say it. She was a young woman who had been handed a set of tools and told they measured everything that mattered, and she had no reason yet to doubt the tools. She had been taught by sincere and intelligent people that what could not be put in the model was not real, and the bee book was nowhere in her model. So, Marion did not argue with the spreadsheet. She got up from the table, went down the cellar stairs, and came back with the leather book, soft as cloth, in her hands, and she set it down on top of the closed laptop. "Read this first," she said, "then build me your model again." Let me tell you what happened to Bree over the next 2 years, because the conversion was slow, and it was the realest thing in the whole story. She did not believe the book at first. She thought it was a sweet old record of a sweet old man. Then she started, almost against her will, to test it. The book said the basswoods on the north line would bloom heavy in a wet June and carry the bees through a gap when nothing else flowered. She marked the date, watched the weather, and watched the basswoods bloom exactly into the gap the book described, and watched the hives gain weight in a week when every other keeper in the county was feeding sugar to keep theirs alive. The book said a hive that foraged. The old orchard tasted different in the jar, brighter, almost green than one that worked the clover bottom, and Bree, who had a good palate and did not expect to use it, tasted the difference herself and could not unknow it. The book was not sentiment. The book was data. It was just data that had been collected by one patient man over 50 years, instead of by an instrument over 1 season, and it described things no instrument in the county was even trying to measure. Bree stopped being a skeptic the day she realized her grandmother's 40 acres were the only place in Bruner County where you could still prove what clean ground did, because everywhere else the evidence had already been sprayed away. Which brings us back to the fence line and to Cliff, and to the years when the conventional path still looked like the winning one. Through 2015 and 2016, Cliff's operation grew. He picked up a lease on another 200 acres, traded the sprayer for a newer one, and posted yields that made the co-op newsletter. Dale Hutchins used Cliff's ground as a demonstration plot, walking, visiting farmers down those ruler straight rows. Once, with a small group of them standing at the property line, Hutchins gestured across at Marion's pasture, at the unmown tangle and the crooked boxes, and called it, in that friendly teaching voice, a museum. "A nice place to visit," he said, "but not a place to make a living." The farmers chuckled. Bree was in the yard and heard it carry across the grass, and she felt her face go hot, and she said nothing because there was nothing yet to say. The numbers were still on his side. That was the second time the word was spoken aloud over Marion's ground. A hobby in the gravel lot in 2009. A museum at the fence in 2016. There would be one more, and then the weather would change. Here is the thing about a system built on a single chemical answer. It is strong in every direction but one, and does not get to choose which direction the pressure comes from. For years, the pressure had come from yield and cost, and in those directions the chemical path was strong and Marion's path was weak. Then, beginning around 2017, the pressure started coming from a direction the maps had never measured, and everything quietly inverted. It came first as rumor and then as rule. The buyers changed before the regulators did, the way they usually do. A few of the big food companies, chasing what their own customers were starting to demand, began asking their suppliers to document what had been sprayed on what and to prove that certain residues stayed below certain thresholds. Honey, it turned out, was one of the most sensitive products on the shelf because a bee samples the whole landscape and brings the average home in the jar. A drum of honey is a kind of confession of every acre within range of the hive. And testing had gotten cheap and precise enough that the confession could now be read in parts per billion. The regional packer, who had paid Marion the flat drum price for years, sent a letter in early 2018 that landed on a lot of kitchen tables in Brunner County at once. From now on, the letter said, honey would be tested before purchase, and any lot that showed insecticide residue above the new limit would be rejected, full stop. The keepers who had run their bees alongside treated fields read that letter and felt the floor. Tilt their honey was clean to the eye and clean to the tongue. It was not clean to the machine. The same invisible chemistry that had been thinning their colonies for a decade was sitting in their comb in numbers they had never had a reason to measure. And now those numbers were the only thing that mattered. Bree tested a jar from Marion's 2018 harvest at a lab in the state capital, paying out of her own pocket because she had to know. The results came back and she read them twice. Marion's honey did not show a reduced level of the residue. It showed none. Below the detection limit, the report said on every compound the new program screened for. Not low, not acceptable, absent. She set the report on the kitchen table in front of her grandmother, and could not for a moment speak. Now, let me tell you what that absence was worth, because this is where the years of paying for it turn into the thing they were always quietly building toward. Buyer named Teresa Okafor ran sourcing for a specialty grocery cooperative out of Chicago, the kind of business that had built its whole reputation on being able to stand behind every jar on its shelf. She had spent the better part of 2 years trying to find domestic honey that could pass her testing without an asterisk, and she had been failing because the landscape that produced most of the country's honey was the same landscape that had gone chemical, and the residues followed the bees home everywhere she looked. She had nearly given up on finding it close and clean both. She heard about Marion through the lab. A technician mentioned, off the record, that a small operation in Brunner County kept turning in honey that screened clean across the board year after year, which almost never happened. Most of the samples that crossed that bench carried at least a trace of something. This one never did. Okafor wrote the name down and sat on it for a month, because she had chased clean honey before and been disappointed every time. The residue turning up on the second test, if not the first. Then she drove down herself in the fall of 2019. She did not come with a clipboard, she came with a spoon. She walked the 40 acres with Marion and Bree on a bright, cool afternoon, and she did the thing the agronomists had never done on that ground. She paid attention to it. She asked about the basswood line and the unsprayed fence arouse and the old orchard, and she listened to the answers the way a person listens when the answers might change their year. She crouched at the edge of the clover and watched the bees work it. She asked how far the nearest treated field was, and nodded slowly when Marion pointed past the north hedgerow and said, "Half a mile and downwind of it besides." She opened the bee book when Marion offered it, and went quiet over the pages the way Bree had, turning them carefully, reading a man's 50 years of attention in his own small hand. Then she sat at the kitchen table and tasted 4 jars, one from each corner of the season, the spring jar pale and grassy, the orchard jar bright and almost green, the clover jar round and clean, the goldenrod jar dark as old brass. She closed her eyes over the orchard jar the way you close your eyes over something you have been looking for a long time. She set the spoon down. She asked Marion one question, and it was not about price. She asked how many more acres like this one Marion thought were left. Marion said she did not know of another in the county. Okafor was quiet for a while, turning the empty spoon over in her fingers. Then she made an offer, and she made it the way serious people make offers, without negotiating against herself. She would take Marion's entire harvest, every pound under a standing annual contract, and she would pay for it on a scale the regional packer had never approached, because she was not buying honey by color and moisture. She was buying the one thing her business could not manufacture and could barely find. She was buying proof. The price she named, per pound, was just over 3 times what Marion had been paid the year before. 3 times. It sat in the kitchen for a moment with no one talking, the way a true number does. Bree, who had built the model that said the bees lost money, who had paid 4 years to learn the math that called them a sentiment, sat very still and did not reach for her laptop. The packer's flat price had treated 50 years of clean ground as worth nothing, because nothing was the only value the old machine could see in it. Okafor's price treated that same ground as the rarest thing she had been sent to find. The honey had not changed. Marion had been making the same honey off the same flowers her whole life. What had changed was that the world had finally built an instrument, honest enough to measure what Walter Voss had been protecting since 1953. And the instrument said it was worth 3 times the going rate and climbing. To the packer, it had been a drum of generic sweetener. To Teresa Okafor, it was the only clean confession of the land she had found in 2 years of looking. Same honey, 2 prices. And the difference between them was just the difference between a system that measured what was easy and a buyer who came with a spoon. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make this the moment Marion won and Cliff and Dale lost, and that is not what happened, and the truth is better. Let me tell you what the same years did to the fence line to the south. Cliff Tanner had done everything right by the book he was handed. That is what makes it hard. When the buyer's testing program spread from honey to grain, and the residue questions started reaching into the markets he sold into, Cliff found himself on the wrong side of a line he had never been told was being drawn. His 600 leased and owned acres were cleaned by every rule that had existed when he planted them, and compromised by the rules that existed now. He had financed his operation on the assumption that the chemical answer would stay the winning answer because every authority he trusted had told him it would. The newer sprayer still had payments on it. The land rent came due on schedule, sector, and the premium markets that might have carried him through were closed to ground with his spray history, not because Cliff was careless, but because he had been faithful to a program that the world had quietly stopped rewarding. He did not lose the farm, I want to say that plainly, because the easy version of this story would take it from him, and the easy version would be a lie about how these things usually go. What Cliff lost was the certainty. He spent 2019 and 2020 restructuring debt, selling the leased acres back one at a time, and shrinking down to a size he could survive at, and it aged him. He let the newer sprayer go to a dealer 2 counties over for less than he owed on it, and made up the difference out of savings he had meant to leave his kids. The confidence that had leaned on Marion's fence and worried for her kindly was gone. He stopped waving at every truck on the road. One evening in the late summer of 2020, he came over and stood at that same fence and asked Marion, not quite able to look at her, how long it took to bring ground back. How many years before the chemistry left the soil and the water and the bloom? It was the first time in 20 years he had asked her a question, instead of warning her, and she heard in it everything it had cost him to walk over and ask. She told him the honest answer, which was that it took longer than anyone wanted, and that it had taken her grandfather a lifetime to never have to start. 10 years, maybe, she said, before the bees would forgive it, and longer before a lab would. Then she told him she would help. She gave him cuttings from the basswood line that fall, dug and bundled with her own hands, and the names of the clovers, and a copy of the pages from the bee book that described how the north hedgerows broke the drift. And she did it without a trace of triumph, because she had buried the man who taught her that you do not gloat at a fence. You hand the thing across it. Cliff took the bundle of cuttings in both arms, like something that might break, and he said, "Thank you, Marion," and his voice did a thing it had not done in front of her in 20 years, and neither of them mentioned it. Which brings us at last to Dale Hutchins, and to the third time a word was spoken over Marion's ground. In the fall of 2021, the Specialty Cooperative ran a feature on Marion's farm, and word of the contract and the price got around the county the way that kind of word does. Hutchins heard it. He was older now, still respected, still sincere, and he had spent his whole career certain that the unmeasurable was the unimportant. He drove out to the Voss place on a gray afternoon, and he stood in the kitchen where the bee book lay open on the table. And the third word he had from Marion's ground was not a hobby. And it was not. He asked if she would teach a workshop. He said it plainly. A man whose model had finally failed in front of him, and who was honest enough to say so. He told her the Extension Service had been getting calls all season from keepers and growers wanting to know how to bring ground back to where it could pass the new tests. And he did not have an answer for them, because the answer was not in any of his programs. The answer was in her cellar, in a dead man's handwriting, in 50 years of one piece of ground watching itself. He had called it sentiment in 2009. He had called it a museum by proxy in 2016. Standing in her kitchen in 2021, he called it the only thing that worked. Marion did not make him pay for the years. She poured him coffee. She told him the bees would have to approve of any workshop, which was as close as Marion Voss ever came to a joke, and Hutchins, to his credit, laughed the way a man laughs when he has finally understood something late. Let me tell you about the workshop, because it is where the whole thing stopped being one woman's stubbornness and became something that could outlive her. They held the first one in the spring of 2022 in Marion's pasture, with 40 keepers and growers sitting on hay bales among the gray boxes while the bees worked the early dandelions around their feet. Cliff was there in the second row, having come back across the fence not to warn anyone this time, but to learn. Bree ran it. She stood up in front of people twice her age with the bee book in her hands, the granddaughter, who had come home 8 years earlier to talk her grandmother out of all this, and she taught them the things she had spent those 8 years learning. She did not start with chemistry or with price. She started by reading them a single line in her great-grandfather's hand, dated 1971, and then she taught them what it meant. She taught them that you cannot test your way to clean ground. You can only build it and protect it, and that protecting it is slower and cheaper and harder than spraying. All at once, she taught them the half-mile rule. A hive is only ever as honest as the half-mile around it. She had it from Walter, through Marion, and now it went out across 40 people into ground all over the county. She told them it would cost them money for years before it paid them anything, and that some of them would quit before it turned. And she told them the truth, because Marion had taught her that a thing worth keeping is worth describing honestly. By the next season, 11 of those 40 keepers had pulled their bees back from the treated fields and started building clean forage, fence a row by fence a row. The slow way. The only way there was. Marion sold them cuttings and starts at a price that barely covered her trouble because her grandfather's book had a note in it from 1979 that she lived by, which said that seed you will not share is seed you have already lost. Wist Teresa Okafor, hearing that the clean ground in Brunner County was spreading, did the thing that told you what kind of buyer she was. She did not try to lock Marion into exclusivity. She offered to buy from the new keepers, too, as they came clean, because her problem had never been one farm. Her problem had been a whole country that had sprayed away its own proof, and here was one county slowly, deliberately growing the proof back, and the price held. That is the part I find hardest to believe and easiest to verify, and it is the quiet hinge the whole story turns on. It was not a bubble that popped. The reason Marion's honey was worth 3 times the drum price was not fashion. It was scarcity of a real thing, clean landscape, and that scarcity did not ease because clean landscape cannot be manufactured on a quarterly schedule. It can only be protected for 50 years or rebuilt over 15. Marion had the only piece in the county that had been protected, and as the rest of the world woke up to what that was worth, the value of having never poisoned her ground did not spike and fade. It compounded. By the time Bree took over the operation outright, the honey from the Voss 40 was selling into 3 cities and a research program, and the 40 acres her grandfather bought for almost nothing in 1951 were acre for acre throwing off more value than the conventional ground around them that had cost 100 times as much to farm. Now let me say the thing this story has been driving at, and then I will let it go. There are 2 kinds of knowledge, and Brunner County spent 20 years finding out which one it had been undervaluing. The first kind is wide and fast and confident. It comes in a jug with a guarantee and a printed map. It describes the land as a system you can fully control, and for as long as the only pressures are the ones it measures, it wins and it deserves to win. and the people who carry it are not fools or villains for trusting it. Dale Hutchins was not a fool. Cliff Tanner was not a fool. They were faithful to a kind of knowing that was real and that worked right up until the world started asking a question that kind of knowing had never thought to measure. The second kind is narrow and slow and patient. It belongs to a single piece of ground and a single person who watches it for a lifetime and writes down what they see. It cannot scale. It cannot be bought in a jug. It looks from the outside like neglect or sentiment or a museum because its value is invisible right up until the moment the world needs exactly the thing it was protecting. And then it turns out to be the only thing money cannot quickly make. Walter Voss spent 50 years building something no instrument in his lifetime could measure. He did it on faith and on attention and on a refusal to poison the half-mile around his bees. He never knew it would be worth 3 times the going rate. He would not have cared. He was not keeping the book for the price. He was keeping it because the land was telling the truth, and somebody ought to write it down. Marion kept the bees when every farm around her went chemical, and for a long time that choice cost her money, and standing and the respect of confident men who meant her no harm. The world is just, but it is slow, and it pays its debts on its own schedule and not on ours. What is rigid, strong, until the wind comes from the one direction, it cannot bend, and then it breaks. What is patient looks weak the whole time and outlasts the wind. In the cellar, under the farmhouse, the bee book still sits on the shelf above the canning jars, soft as cloth, open now more often than it is closed, because Bree adds to it every season in her own hand, below her great-grandfather's. And out in the pasture, in the long amber light of an evening in late September, the colonies that have never tasted a poisoned flower fly home heavy across 40 acres of clean ground, the way they did when Walter watched them, the way they will when Bree is old. The honey was never the inheritance. The half-mile was